My name's Rachel. I'm 36. And at my father's will reading, my stepsister leaned in, smirked, and said, "You get $15. She thought she had just inherited Dad's $160 million fortune. But when the lawyer turned the next page, her face went white. Before I tell you what happened next, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because stories like this, they have a way of disappearing when the wrong people hear the truth. You want to know what it feels like to be erased from your own family's story? To watch someone waltz in and rewrite every chapter that was supposed to have your name in it? Let me take you back to the beginning, to the day my world cracked in half and never quite healed right again. I was 11 when my mother died. 11 years old, sitting in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, watching the strongest woman I'd ever known fade away like watercolors in the rain. Cancer, they said. Aggressive. Fast. The kind that doesn't negotiate or give you time to say proper goodbyes. My father held my hand at the funeral, his grip so tight it hurt, like he was afraid I might disappear too. "It's just us now, Rachel," he whispered, his voice cracking like ice on a frozen lake. "Just us against the world." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. For 2 years, it really was just us. 2 lost souls learning how to make breakfast without Mom's pancakes, how to do laundry without her humming, how to exist in a house that felt too big and too quiet and too full of ghosts. We were broken together, healing together, building something new from the wreckage of our grief. I learned to take care of him the way Mom had. I learned to make his coffee exactly right. 2 sugars, splash of cream, stirred counterclockwise because that's how she'd done it. I learned to iron his shirts, even though my small hands could barely manage the sleeves. I learned to be everything he needed because I was terrified that if I wasn't enough, he might disappear too. And for a while, it worked. We had our routines. Saturday morning pottery lessons where he'd sit beside me at the wheel, his large hands guiding mine, showing me how to center the clay, how to be patient with something that wanted to collapse. "Pottery is like life, Rachel," he'd say. "You have to find the balance between holding on and letting go." Those were the golden years. The years before her. Margaret Thornfield entered our lives like a hurricane disguised as a gentle breeze. She was everything my mother hadn't been. Loud where Mom was soft, flashy where Mom was elegant, commanding where Mom was nurturing. She swept into our quiet little world with her perfectly styled blonde hair and her designer clothes and her daughter who was exactly my age but everything I wasn't. Vanessa, even her name sounded like money and privilege and entitlement. She was 13 when they moved in, same as me, but she carried herself like she'd been born understanding secrets about the world that I'd never been taught. Her clothes came from stores I'd never heard of. Her hair was always perfect, like she had a personal stylist hiding in her bedroom. Her laugh was musical and practiced, the kind of sound that made adults turn their heads and smile indulgently. And she hated me on sight. Not the kind of dislike that comes from personality clashes or teenage drama. This was something deeper, more calculated. She looked at me the way someone looks at a stain on expensive fabric, like I was something that needed to be removed before anyone important noticed. The first dinner with our new family was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as getting to know each other. Margaret had made reservations at the fanciest restaurant in town, the kind of place where the menus don't have prices and the waiters speak in hushed, reverent tones. I felt like an imposter in my simple black dress, the one Dad had bought me for Mom's funeral, and I'd been wearing to every important occasion since. Vanessa glided in wearing something that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget, looking like she'd stepped off the pages of a magazine. She ordered in French, actual French, while I stumbled through the English descriptions trying to figure out what half the words meant. "Rachel's very artistic," Dad said, trying to include me in the conversation. "She's quite talented with pottery." Margaret smiled that bright, empty smile that I'd learned to recognize as her default expression when she had nothing genuine to offer. "How quaint." "Vanessa plays violin." She's been accepted to the summer program at Juilliard. And there it was, the first comparison, the first measurement, the first time I felt myself coming up short in a competition I didn't even know I was entering. Vanessa smiled sweetly and said, "I'd love to see your pottery sometime, Rachel. I'm sure it's very rustic." The way she said rustic made it sound like a disease. From that moment on, every interaction was a chess game, where I didn't know the rules, and she was always 3 moves ahead. When Dad asked about our days, she had stories about academic achievements and social triumphs. I had dirty fingernails and clay-stained clothes, and small, quiet victories that sounded pathetic when spoken aloud. Within 6 months, the weekly pottery lessons stopped. "Dad's too busy now," became the standard explanation. Too busy with Margaret's charity galas and Vanessa's recitals and the elaborate social calendar that came with his new wife's expectations. The pottery wheel gathered dust in the basement while upstairs. Our house was transformed into something unrecognizable. Gone were Mom's warm, earthy decorations, replaced by Margaret's cold, modern aesthetic. Gone were the family photos that showed our old life, replaced by new professional portraits that looked like advertisements for the perfect blended family. Gone was the quiet intimacy that Dad and I had built from our shared grief, replaced by the constant noise of a household where I was increasingly becoming a stranger. But the real destruction was more subtle than furniture rearrangement. It was in the way Dad started looking at me differently, not with the warm recognition of a daughter he cherished, but with a kind of apologetic disappointment, like I was a reminder of a life he was trying to move past. Margaret was a master manipulator, and she worked on him with the patience of a spider spinning a web. She never directly criticized me. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she made observations. "Rachel seems so sad all the time. Maybe she needs more structure. Vanessa is so excited about her future. I worry that Rachel doesn't have that same drive." And slowly, gradually, Dad began to see me through her eyes. The quiet daughter became the sullen daughter. The thoughtful pause became antisocial behavior. The artistic temperament became a lack of ambition. Every trait that had once been precious to him was reframed as a problem that needed fixing. Vanessa, meanwhile, was playing her own game. She was smart enough to never be cruel when adults were watching. Her attacks were surgical strikes designed to leave no evidence. A comment about my clothes when we passed in the hallway. A laugh when I mispronounced something at dinner. The way she'd accidentally spill something on my homework or forget to tell me about family plans. But the worst part wasn't her cruelty. It was watching Dad fall for it. Watching him light up when she entered a room the way he used to light up for me. Watching him attend every one of her performances while my pottery pieces sat unnoticed on the kitchen counter. Watching him become someone I didn't recognize. A man who valued appearance over authenticity, performance over truth. High school was a special kind of hell. We attended the same private school, of course, because Margaret insisted on the best education for both girls. But Vanessa ruled that school like a queen, surrounded by other wealthy, beautiful, cruel children who treated social destruction like an art form. I became invisible by necessity. It was safer than being a target. I ate lunch alone, did projects alone, walked the halls like a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. I threw myself into my pottery with desperate intensity, spending hours in the art room after school, creating beautiful things that no one at home cared to see. My art teacher, Mrs. Chen, was the only adult who seemed to understand what was happening to me. She'd stay late sometimes, just to sit quietly while I worked, offering gentle encouragement and asking questions about my pieces that showed she really saw them. "Art is honesty," she told me one afternoon as I shaped a particularly difficult bowl. "It's the one place where you can't lie, even if you want to. The clay knows the truth of your hands. The fire reveals what's really there." I thought about that a lot in those days, about truth and honesty and what my hands were revealing to the clay, about whether the sadness I was shaping into every piece was as obvious to others as it was to me. At home, I learned to make myself smaller, quieter, more invisible. I stopped trying to compete with Vanessa's accomplishments because every attempt just highlighted how far behind I was falling. When she got accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, I congratulated her with genuine sincerity because I'd learned that resentment was a luxury I couldn't afford. Dad cried with pride that day. Actually cried. I hadn't seen him cry since Mom's funeral, and watching him weep with joy over Vanessa's achievements was like watching him bury the last piece of our old life together. College was my escape hatch. I chose a small liberal arts school 3 states away, far enough to disappear but close enough that Dad couldn't complain about the distance. I majored in art therapy, thinking maybe I could help other broken kids find their way back to themselves, the way pottery had helped me find mine. For 4 years, I barely went home. Christmas and maybe Easter, just enough to maintain the fiction that we were still a family. Each visit was more painful than the last, as I watched Vanessa establish herself as the permanent daughter, while I became the visiting stranger. She'd regale us with stories of her internships at prestigious law firms, her networking events with powerful people, her strategic 5-year plan for career advancement. I'd talk about my art and therapy work, and watch Dad's eyes glaze over with polite disinterest. "That's nice, honey," he'd say, the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. But when Vanessa talked about her latest achievement, he hung on every word like she was revealing the secrets of the universe. After college, I moved to a small town about an hour from the city where Dad lived. Close enough to visit, far enough to breathe. I opened my pottery studio and started building a quiet life for myself. One day, one piece, one small act of creation at a time. The studio became my sanctuary, a place where I could work with my hands and find peace in the simple honesty of clay and fire. My pieces were selling well at local galleries, and I was building a reputation as an artist who created functional beauty with emotional depth, but that success felt hollow when I had no one to share it with. Dad would ask about my work in the same polite, distant way he might inquire about a stranger's hobbies. He never visited the studio, never saw the pieces that poured out of my grief and longing and stubborn hope. Meanwhile, Vanessa had graduated from Harvard Law with honors and landed a position at one of the most prestigious firms in the country. Margaret made sure everyone knew about every promotion, every accolade, every sign that her daughter was destined for greatness. The wedding invitations came 5 years after I'd graduated college. Dad was marrying Margaret in a ceremony that was more corporate merger than romantic celebration. I wasn't asked to be in the wedding party, of course. Vanessa was the maid of honor, radiant in designer silk, while I sat in the back row wearing a dress I'd bought on sale and feeling like a trespasser at my own father's wedding. That night, at the reception, was when Vanessa said it, the thing that would echo in my head for years to come. We were standing by the bar, and she was slightly drunk on champagne and triumph, her mask slipping just enough to reveal the venom underneath. "You know what I love about tonight?" she said. Her voice honey-sweet but her eyes cold as winter. Finally making it official. Family was always a competition, Rachel. And competitions need winners and losers. She raised her glass in a mock toast. "Thanks for making it so easy." I didn't respond. What could I say? She was right. In every way that mattered to Dad, she had won. She was the successful daughter, the one who made him proud, the one who fit into the life he'd built with Margaret. I was the leftover piece from his old life, kept around out of obligation rather than love. The years after the wedding were a masterclass in emotional abandonment, disguised as busy schedules and prior commitments. Dad's calls became perfunctory check-ins, duty calls made because conscience demanded it but heart no longer wanted it. "How's the pottery business?" he'd ask, and I could hear him multitasking, probably reading emails or reviewing documents while we talked. When I tried to tell him about a successful show or a particularly meaningful piece, he'd cut me off with, "That's great, honey. Listen, I've got to run, but we should catch up soon." Soon never came. Meanwhile, Vanessa's career exploded into the kind of success that made headlines. She was profiled in business magazines, quoted in newspaper articles, invited to speak at conferences about women in law. Dad collected every clipping, every mention, proudly showing them to anyone who would listen. I found out about her achievements the same way strangers did, through social media and news articles. She'd post pictures of herself with celebrities and politicians, always perfectly composed, always winning. And in the background of some family photos, I could see Dad beaming with pride, his arm around his real daughter, while I remained conspicuously absent. The isolation was eating me alive. I was successful in my own right. My pottery was featured in galleries. I was teaching workshops. I was building something meaningful from the wreckage of my broken family. But success felt meaningless when the person whose approval I'd spent my whole life seeking couldn't be bothered to notice. I started therapy. Dr. Martinez was a kind woman who specialized in family trauma, and she helped me understand that my father's neglect wasn't a reflection of my worth. Sometimes, she said, people choose the easier love. The love that doesn't remind them of pain or require them to be vulnerable. But understanding something intellectually and healing from it emotionally are two very different things. I still checked my phone obsessively, hoping for a text from Dad that never came. I still practiced conversations in my head, rehearsing things I wanted to tell him about my life and my work, even though I knew he'd never really listen. The breaking point came 3 years ago at Dad's birthday party. Margaret had organized an elaborate celebration at their country club, complete with a jazz band and catered dinner and a guest list that read like a who's who of local society. I arrived early, hoping to have a few minutes alone with Dad before the crowd descended. I found him in his study, looking distinguished in his tuxedo, reading over what looked like business documents. "Dad?" I knocked softly on the doorframe. "Happy birthday." He looked up, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of something that might have been warmth. But then his expression shifted back to polite distance. "Rachel, you made it." He stood and gave me a brief, uncomfortable hug that felt more like a handshake with arms. "You look nice." I was wearing a vintage dress I'd found at a consignment shop and restored myself, paired with a necklace I'd made from pottery beads. I'd spent hours getting ready, wanting to look beautiful for him, wanting him to be proud to introduce me to his friends. "I brought you something." I handed him a small wrapped package. Inside was a mug I'd made specifically for him. Simple, elegant, with a subtle glaze that shifted color in different light. I'd spent weeks perfecting it, remembering how he used to love his morning coffee, how we'd shared those quiet moments in the kitchen before the world intruded. He unwrapped it with the kind of careful attention you give to something you're obligated to appreciate. "It's very nice. Thank you." Nice. The word hung between us like a wall. Not beautiful, not meaningful, not precious. Nice. The kind of word you use to describe a generic gift from someone you barely know. Before I could respond, Vanessa swept into the room like a force of nature. She was wearing a designer gown that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Diamonds glittering at her throat and ears, looking like she'd stepped off a red carpet. "Daddy!" She threw her arms around him with the kind of easy affection I'd forgotten how to show. "Are you ready for your surprise?" She led him to the window overlooking the club's parking lot, where a brand new Bentley sat gleaming under the evening lights. A Bentley. She'd bought him a car that cost more than most people's houses. "Vanessa." Dad's voice was thick with emotion. "You shouldn't have. You deserve the best," she said, and I watched my father's eyes fill with tears of joy and pride and love that I hadn't seen since I was 11 years old. The party was a 3-hour showcase of everything I wasn't. Vanessa gave a speech about Dad's influence on her success, about how he'd taught her to dream big and work hard and never settle for less than excellence. She thanked him for being the kind of father who pushed her to be her best self, who believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. The guests hung on every word, dabbing at their eyes, nodding along with the beautiful picture she painted of their relationship. And Dad. Dad looked at her like she'd hung the moon and stars just for him. I left before the cake, slipped out while everyone was listening to another one of Vanessa's charming anecdotes about family vacations I'd never been invited on. Nobody noticed I was gone. That night, I sat in my empty studio, surrounded by shelves of pottery that no one in my family would ever see, and I made a decision. I was done. Done, hoping for scraps of attention. Done begging for love that was never coming. Done believing that if I just tried harder, was better, achieved more, Dad might remember that I was his daughter too. I started living my life for me. I stopped calling, stopped sending birthday gifts that were received with polite indifference, stopped attending family events where I felt like a stranger intruding on other people's happiness. I poured everything into my art, into my students, into building a life that had meaning even if it didn't have the one thing I'd always wanted most. The silence stretched between us for months. At first, I waited for Dad to notice, to call and ask why I'd gone quiet, but the phone never rang. My absence was as invisible as my presence had been. I heard about his diagnosis through Margaret's Christmas card. Pancreatic cancer, aggressive, fast. The same kind of merciless disease that had taken Mom, coming full circle to claim the only parent I had left. The card was one of those glossy family newsletters that wealthy people send to announce their year's achievements. Vanessa's promotion to senior partner, Margaret's charity work, and buried in the middle, almost as an afterthought, we're facing some health challenges this year, but remain optimistic. Health challenges. Like cancer was a scheduling conflict rather than a death sentence. I wanted to call. Wanted to drive to his house and demand to know why I'd had to learn about his terminal diagnosis from a Christmas card. Wanted to shake him and scream that I was his daughter, that I deserved to know, that I deserved the chance to say goodbye properly this time. But I didn't. Because I'd learned that wanting something and deserving something are very different from receiving something. And I'd had my heart broken enough times to know that some doors close permanently, no matter how hard you knock. Instead, I threw myself into my work with desperate intensity. I created piece after piece, each one infused with the grief and rage and love I couldn't express any other way. My hands knew the truth even when my heart couldn't bear it. I was losing him all over again, and this time it would be forever. The pieces from that period were different from anything I'd made before. Darker, more complex, shot through with veins of gold where I deliberately let them crack, and then repaired them with the Japanese technique of kintsugi, finding beauty in brokenness, making the damage part of the art rather than something to hide. Mrs. Chen, my old art teacher, came to my show that spring. She was retired now, her hair silver and her hands gentle as ever as she examined my work. "These are extraordinary," she said, running her fingers along the golden scars of a particularly complex vase. "They're about loss, aren't they? About learning to be beautiful even when you're broken." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "He doesn't know what he's missing," she said quietly. "But the clay knows. The fire knows. And someday, when it matters most, that will be enough." I didn't understand what she meant then, but I filed her words away in the part of my heart that still hoped for miracles, even when logic said hope was foolish. The call about the will reading came on a Tuesday in October. Not from Dad. He was too sick to make calls by then. Not from Margaret. She'd never spoken to me unless absolutely necessary. It came from a lawyer's office, delivered in the professionally neutral tone that law firms use to distance themselves from the human wreckage they're required to handle. "Miss Wren, this is Johnson, Pierce & Associates. We're handling your father's estate. The will reading is scheduled for this Friday at 2 p.m. You're required to attend. Required. Not invited. Not requested. Required. Like jury duty, or a tax audit. Even dying. Dad was making it clear that my presence was an obligation, rather than a desire." I hung up the phone and sat in my studio, surrounded by my latest pieces, a series exploring themes of abandonment and resilience. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been creating art about being forgotten, while living the reality of being forgotten. Part of me wanted to skip it, to maintain my dignity and let them read their will without the inconvenience of my presence. What was the point of showing up just to be humiliated one final time? But another part of me, The stubborn, hopeful part that had never quite learned when to quit, needed to see it through to the end. I spent the rest of the week in a strange state of suspended animation. I couldn't work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly. I kept thinking about that last conversation with Dad, about the mug I'd made him that he'd dismissed with the word nice. I wondered if he'd ever used it, or if it was sitting in some cabinet, forgotten like its maker. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself was mourning. I dressed carefully in my only black suit, the one I'd bought for job interviews years ago and rarely had occasion to wear. I wanted to look respectable, professional, like someone who deserved to be taken seriously even if I knew I wouldn't be. The drive to the lawyer's office felt like a funeral procession for one. Past the familiar landmarks of my childhood, through the expensive neighborhood where Dad and Margaret lived, into the heart of the business district where money and power made their transactions behind steel and glass doors. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower, all marble and mahogany, and the kind of intimidating luxury that was designed to make clients feel either impressed or inadequate, depending on which side of the transaction they were on. I knew which side I was on. The receptionist directed me to a conference room that could have housed a small airplane. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the table was long enough to seat 30 people comfortably. Today it would host maybe 8, but the space felt designed to dwarf human concerns, to make personal pain seem insignificant against the backdrop of legal protocol. I was the first to arrive, which shouldn't have surprised me. Punctuality had been one of the few values Dad had consistently reinforced during my childhood, back when he still cared enough to teach me anything. I took a seat halfway down the table, not wanting to seem presumptuous by sitting too close to the head, but not wanting to exile myself to the far end either. The others arrived in a parade of expensive suits and practiced grief. Margaret entered first, draped in black Chanel and looking like a professional widow. She nodded at me with the kind of cool acknowledgement you might give a stranger in an elevator. "Rachel, you look well." The lie hung between us, polite and meaningless. I looked exhausted and heartbroken and like I'd been crying for days, because I had been. But social conventions required the fiction that everything was fine, that we were all just here for a routine legal procedure rather than the final destruction of what had once been a family. Behind Margaret came the supporting cast. Distant relatives I barely recognized, business associates who'd known Dad longer than I had, family friends who'd watched me disappear from family events and never asked why. They filled the room with murmured condolences and the rustle of expensive fabric, creating a buffer of noise that kept anyone from having to engage in actual conversation. And then she arrived. Vanessa entered like she was walking a red carpet, even in mourning. Her black dress was perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless despite what should have been a day of grief. She moved through the room accepting condolences like she was receiving congratulations, playing the role of the devastated daughter with the skill of someone who'd been practicing for years. When she saw me, her expression shifted so subtly that anyone watching might have missed it, but I caught the flicker of surprise, followed by something that looked almost like annoyance. She hadn't expected me to come. In her mind, I'd already faded away completely, a problem that had solved itself through neglect. She made her way around the table, accepting hugs and whispered sympathies, before finally reaching me. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this moment would play out. "You actually came. How sweet." Her voice carried just enough warmth to sound genuine to observers, but I caught the razor blade hidden in the honey. She was already playing to her audience, already setting up the narrative where she was the grieving daughter graciously acknowledging the troubled family member who'd shown up unexpectedly. "Dad always said I should finish what I start," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the way my hands were shaking under the table. She tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "I'm surprised he even told you about today. You two hadn't spoken in so long." The comment was delivered with surgical precision, designed to hurt while appearing sympathetic. She was letting everyone in the room know that I was the estranged daughter, the one who'd abandoned poor Dad in his final months. The fact that he'd been the one to create the distance was conveniently omitted from her version of events. I didn't respond. What was the point? In 10 minutes, this would all be over, and I could return to my quiet life and try to forget that I'd ever hoped for anything different. Subscribe right now, because what happens next is the kind of justice you only see once. And if you blink, you'll miss it. The lawyer entered at precisely 2 p.m., carrying himself with the kind of grave dignity that expensive legal education provides. He was older than I'd expected, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His suit probably cost more than my car, and he moved with the confidence of someone who'd presided over the dismantling of fortunes and families for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I'm James Morrison, senior partner at Johnson, Pierce & Associates. I'll be executing the last will and testament of Robert Wren. The room fell silent except for the soft scratch of his pen as he made notes and the distant hum of city traffic far below. He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a thick document, its pages crisp and formal and final. Before we begin, I want to note that this will was executed with full legal formality and witnessed according to state law. Mr. Wren was of sound mind and body when these documents were prepared, and there should be no question as to their validity. I wondered if that disclaimer was standard procedure or if Dad had anticipated challenges to his final wishes. Given the tension that had always simmered beneath our family's surface, maybe he'd been smart to lawyer-proof his last act. Morrison began with the standard language, the legal boilerplate that turns human relationships into property transfers and emotional bonds into asset distributions. I half listened, my attention caught by the rain streaming down the windows, and the way it fractured the city view into something abstract and blurred. Then came the small bequests. $5,000 to the housekeeper who'd worked for them for 15 years, $10,000 to the gardener, a vintage watch to Dad's college roommate, charitable donations to organizations I'd never heard of, causes that apparently mattered to him though he'd never mentioned them to me. Each gift was read with professional neutrality, but they painted a picture of a man who'd been generous with everyone except his own daughter. Even strangers had warranted more consideration than I had. Vanessa sat perfectly still through this portion, her hands folded in her lap, her expression appropriately somber. But I caught the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth, the barely contained excitement of someone waiting for their cue in a play they'd helped write. Margaret received the house and its contents, along with a trust fund that would keep her comfortable for life. To my beloved wife, who brought light back into my world after the darkest period of my life. The words were Dad's, but hearing them felt like listening to a stranger's voice describe a story I'd never been part of. More business associates, more friends, more evidence that Dad had maintained relationships with dozens of people who apparently mattered more to him than I did. The list seemed endless, a catalog of everyone who'd been important enough to remember in his final accounting of what mattered. And then Morrison paused, his eyes finding mine across the conference table. To my daughter Rachel Wren, I leave the sum of $15 sufficient for her trip home. The words hit the room like a physical blow. I felt the collective intake of breath, the sudden tension as everyone processed what they'd just heard. $15, not 15,000, not 1,500. $15, the price of a cheap lunch, the cost of a tank of gas, the final measurement of my worth in my father's eyes. The room erupted in whispers and gasps and barely contained laughter. Someone in the back actually giggled before catching themselves. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, the familiar burn of humiliation that I'd been carrying for 25 years finally given its perfect, public expression. Vanessa's reaction was the worst part. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with what looked like shock, but I could see the triumph blazing beneath the performance. She'd won, completely, absolutely, finally. The competition she'd declared at Dad's wedding was over, and she'd claimed victory in the most brutal way possible. "Oh my God, Rachel," she whispered, just loud enough for the room to hear. I'm so sorry. I had no idea Dad felt. She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. This was worse than being forgotten. This was being remembered specifically to be rejected. Dad had thought about me long enough to include me in his will for the sole purpose of making his disappointment official and public. The whispers continued around me, a symphony of shock and pity and barely concealed satisfaction from people who'd always known I didn't belong. Can you believe? $15. What could she have done? Poor thing. Poor thing. That's what I'd become. The cautionary tale about what happens when you don't live up to family expectations. The object lesson in disappointment that people would discuss at dinner parties for years to come. Morrison cleared his throat, his professional composure cracking slightly, as he looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Miss Wren, I want to assure you that this bequest was very specifically worded by your father. He was quite clear about the amount and the reasoning, as if there could be any reasonable explanation for this level of cruelty, as if $15 plus public humiliation was somehow a logical response to whatever crimes I'd committed by being born, by surviving my mother's death, by failing to become the daughter he'd apparently wanted. Vanessa leaned forward in her chair, her voice carrying just the right note of concerned compassion. Mr. Morrison, is there any possibility of a mistake? This seems so unlike Dad. He was always so generous, so loving. Another perfect performance, painting herself as the shocked and saddened daughter while positioning me as the family failure who'd somehow earned this treatment. I can assure you there's no mistake, Morrison replied, consulting his notes. Mr. Wren was very specific about all provisions of this will. Very deliberate. The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, heavy with judgment and conclusion, and the collective decision that whatever had happened between Dad and me, I must have deserved this. People were already crafting their versions of the story, filling in the blanks with assumptions about what kind of daughter gets left $15 while everyone else receives thousands. I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. Is that all? Morrison glanced down at his papers, then back at me. For a moment, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty that seemed out of place in such a controlled environment. Actually, he paused, shuffling through the documents with more attention than they'd received before. There appears to be. Before we conclude, there is a sealed addendum. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of confusion through the room. Vanessa's perfectly composed expression flickered, just for a second, with something that might have been concern. An addendum? Margaret's voice was sharp with surprise. Robert never mentioned any addendum. Morrison was examining a red wax envelope that he hadn't opened before, turning it over in his hands like he was seeing it for the first time. This document was sealed separately and includes specific instructions that it be read after the primary bequests. He looked up at the room, his professional mask firmly back in place. It was signed and notarized 3 weeks before Mr. Wren's passing. 3 weeks. The timing sent a chill through my chest. 3 weeks before he died, Dad had been planning something secret enough to warrant a separate sealed document, something important enough to hide from his wife and favorite daughter. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite your life, subscribe now, because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the sound of truth loading its final bullet. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The smug satisfaction that had followed my humiliation was replaced by nervous tension, as everyone tried to figure out what this new development meant. Vanessa was no longer smiling, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Morrison broke the red wax seal with deliberate care, the crack echoing through the silent room like a gunshot. He unfolded the document, several pages of heavy paper covered in Dad's distinctive handwriting rather than the typed formality of the main will. This addendum was written entirely in Mr. Wren's hand, and properly witnessed, Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. He left specific instructions that it be read aloud in its entirety. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice carrying across the room with the weight of words that had been waiting weeks to be spoken. If you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and my final wishes are being carried out according to my design. For 25 years, I have watched my 2 daughters grow into the women they chose to become. One valued image over integrity, manipulation over honesty, taking over giving. The other chose truth over everything else, even when that truth was painful, even when it meant standing alone. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Vanessa had gone pale, her carefully applied makeup standing out starkly against her suddenly bloodless skin. Morrison continued, "To those who witnessed what appeared to be favoritism, I offer this explanation. I was not choosing between my daughters. I was teaching them to choose themselves. One daughter learned to demand everything and appreciate nothing. The other learned to ask for nothing and treasure everything." My throat was tight, my vision blurring with tears I hadn't expected. These were Dad's words, but they sounded like they came from a stranger, someone who had been watching and understanding when I thought he'd stopped caring entirely. "Rachel," Morrison continued, reading Dad's handwritten words, "you have spent your adult life believing you were invisible to me, but a parent sees everything, even when love requires the appearance of distance, especially then." The tears came harder now, 25 years of grief and abandonment and stubborn hope pouring out of me in ugly, silent sobs. Around the room, people were shifting uncomfortably, realizing they were witnessing something far more complex than the simple inheritance distribution they'd expected. "Your stepsister will tell you that she earned my favor through achievement and charm. What she doesn't understand is that real love isn't earned, it simply is. It doesn't require performance or manipulation or the constant proof of worthiness. It exists in the quiet moments, in the things that don't need to be said, in the space between expectation and acceptance." Vanessa made a sound, half gasp, half sob, and her hand flew to her mouth. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely afraid. Morrison's voice grew stronger as he continued, "I know you will think this letter comes too late, that these words should have been spoken while I was alive to see their effect. You're right, my silence was the greatest failure of my later years. But I needed to know who you would become when you thought no one was watching, when there was no reward for goodness except goodness itself. The business associates and distant relatives were looking anywhere but at me, uncomfortable with the raw emotion that was transforming what should have been a routine legal proceeding into something that felt like a reckoning. You chose dignity over desperation. You chose creation over destruction. You chose to build something beautiful from the fragments of a broken relationship, rather than demanding that I rebuild it for you. That choice, Rachel, is worth more than any inheritance I could leave you." My hands were shaking so violently I had to clasp them together to stop the trembling. This was impossible. The father who had written these words was not the same man who had spent years making me feel like a stranger in my own family. But the handwriting was his, the voice was his. The intimate knowledge of my struggles could only have come from him. Morrison paused, looking directly at me before continuing. "But because this world runs on more than love and recognition, because practical matters require practical solutions, I am hereby amending my will with the following provisions." He turned to a new page, his voice taking on the formal tone of legal declaration. "To my daughter Rachel Wren, who never asked for anything but gave me everything that mattered, I leave all remaining assets of my estate, including but not limited to the investment portfolio currently valued at $160 million, the property holdings, the art collection, and all business interests not previously designated to other beneficiaries." The room exploded, not in sound. The shock was too complete for noise, but in a kind of collective stunned silence that felt louder than screaming. Margaret made a choking sound. Someone dropped their pen and it clattered against the table like gunfire. Vanessa stood up so quickly her chair fell backward, the crash echoing through the marble-walled room. "That's not possible," she whispered, then louder. "That's not possible. He's lying. Someone made him write this." But Morrison wasn't finished. He continued reading with implacable calm. "I know this decision will seem cruel to some, unjust to others. But justice isn't about equal distribution. It's about recognition of true value. Vanessa has spent her adult life accumulating wealth, power, and position. She has never known want, never experienced real loss, never learned that the most precious things in life cannot be bought or earned through manipulation." Vanessa was crying now, but these weren't the pretty tears of a grieving daughter. These were the ugly, desperate sobs of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. Rachel has spent her adult life creating beauty from brokenness, offering her gifts to the world without demanding recognition, building something meaningful from the scraps of attention I gave her. She learned to find value in herself when no one else would validate her worth. That lesson, that strength, that quiet dignity, these are the qualities I want to reward. Morrison looked up from the letter, his eyes finding mine across the chaos. "There's more, Miss Wren. Your father wanted to explain his reasoning fully. He returned to the handwritten pages. To Vanessa, I leave $15, the same amount I initially left to Rachel. This is not punishment, though I know it will feel like it. This is a lesson. $15 represents the price of humility, the cost of understanding that worth cannot be measured in currency or achievements, or the ability to manipulate others' affections." Vanessa screamed then, a sound of pure anguish that echoed off the marble walls like a wounded animal crying in the wilderness. "This isn't fair. I did everything right. I was the perfect daughter." But Dad's letter wasn't finished with her. "If you are capable of learning from this moment, if you can find within yourself the grace to understand why your sister deserves what I am giving her, then you will have gained something far more valuable than money. If you cannot, then you have proven that my decision was correct." The security guards were moving toward Vanessa now, called by the receptionist who'd heard the screaming through the thick conference room doors. But she wasn't finished. She turned toward me, her face twisted with 25 years of entitlement and fury. "You think you've won something? You think this changes anything?" Her voice was raw with hatred. "You're still the same pathetic little girl who couldn't compete with me, who hid in the basement making mud pies while I built a real life." I stood slowly, my legs unsteady but my voice surprisingly calm when it came. "I don't need to compete with you, Vanessa. I never did." The letter had given me something I hadn't expected. Not just money, though the sum was staggering enough to change everything about my practical life. It had given me the knowledge that I had been seen, that my quiet strength had been noticed and valued, that the love I'd thought was lost had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Morrison was still reading. "Rachel, you will find additional documents in my study at home. The brass key I am leaving for you will open a box in my desk drawer. Inside, you will find letters I wrote but never sent, pictures I kept but never shared, and a record of every achievement, every art show, every small triumph you thought went unnoticed. A brass key." He handed it to me across the table, its warm weight solid and real in my trembling palm. "Your father was very specific about this, Miss Wren. He said the key was not for money. You'll have more than enough of that. The key is for closure." Vanessa was being escorted from the room now, her sobs echoing down the hallway as security led her away. Margaret sat in her chair like a statue, her face a mask of shock and calculation as she tried to process what this meant for her comfortable future. But I was barely aware of their presence anymore. The letter was ending, and Morrison's voice carried Dad's final words to me across the distance of death and years of misunderstanding. "My darling daughter, I know you will struggle to forgive my silence, my distance, my apparent failure to love you as you deserved. I hope you will understand that sometimes a parent's greatest gift is teaching their child to find strength in themselves rather than in others' approval. You found that strength. You became someone extraordinary not because of my attention, but despite its absence." The tears were flowing freely now, and I didn't try to stop them. Around the room, the remaining relatives and associates were gathering their things, preparing to leave this scene of family destruction and public revelation. But I sat still, listening to the last words my father would ever speak to me. "You have given me the greatest gift any parent can receive, the knowledge that I raised a daughter of true character, someone who creates rather than destroys, who gives rather than takes, who finds light even in the darkest places. The money I am leaving you is not a reward for being good. It is a tool for being great." Morrison folded the letter carefully, his task nearly complete. But he looked at me with something approaching kindness as he delivered the final line. "Be happy, Rachel. Create beauty. Love generously. And know that in the end, you were the daughter who mattered most." The room was nearly empty now. Margaret had left without a word, probably to call her lawyers and see if there was any way to contest what had just happened. The relatives and business associates had filed out in uncomfortable silence, eager to escape the emotional wreckage they'd witnessed. I sat alone with Morrison and the weight of everything that had just changed. $160 million. More money than I could conceptualize, enough to transform not just my life but the lives of everyone I touched. But more than that, the knowledge that I had been loved, deeply and completely, by a man who had simply been too broken by his own grief to show it while he was alive. "Miss Wren," Morrison said gently, "I need to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? This inheritance will change everything about your life. There will be legal challenges from Mrs. Wren and her daughter. There will be media attention. There will be people who emerge from nowhere claiming relationship or debt or entitlement to what you've received." I looked at him, this stranger who had just delivered the most important message of my life, and found my voice steady for the first time in hours. "Mr. Morrison, for 36 years, I've been preparing for a life where I had nothing but what I could create with my own hands. I think I can handle having more." That night, I drove to Dad's house. My house now, I supposed, though the legal details would take time to sort out. Margaret's car was gone from the driveway, and the windows were dark except for one light burning in the study where Dad had spent his final months. I used the brass key Morrison had given me, my hands shaking as I unlocked the desk drawer Dad had specified in his letter. Inside was a wooden box, simple and unadorned, the kind of thing that might hold jewelry or important papers. But when I opened it, I found something far more precious than either. Letters. Dozens of them, written in Dad's careful handwriting, addressed to me but never sent. Letters about art shows he'd attended in secret, standing in the back of galleries to watch strangers admire my work. Letters about conversations with Margaret where he'd defended my choices against her criticism. Letters about his pride in my independence, his respect for my strength, his love for the woman I'd become despite, rather than because of his parenting. One letter was dated just days after my last visit, the disastrous birthday party where I'd felt so invisible and unwanted. "My dearest Rachel," it began, "I watched you leave tonight and wanted to run after you, to tell you that the mug you made me is the most beautiful thing I own, and that I drink my coffee from it every morning, and think of the little girl who used to help me center clay on the pottery wheel. But I am a coward, trapped by choices I made years ago, afraid that reaching out now would seem like too little, too late." Another letter, written after my first gallery show. "I bought 3 of your pieces today, though I had to use a false name so you wouldn't know. They sit in my office now, the only decorations that matter, reminders of the daughter who inherited her mother's soul and somehow found the strength to nurture it despite my neglect." There were photographs too, pictures of me at art shows, at my studio, even walking down the street near my home. He had been watching, attending, caring from a distance because he believed his presence would somehow diminish what I'd built independently. The final letter was dated just a week before he died. "I know you will think this inheritance is too late, that these words should have been spoken when I was alive, to see your face when you heard them. You're right. But I needed to know who you would become when you thought the whole world had forgotten you. You became someone extraordinary. You became someone who didn't need my approval to know her own worth. That is the greatest gift any parent can give their child, the knowledge that they are complete in themselves. I sat in his study until dawn, reading every letter, studying every photograph, trying to reconcile the father who had written these words with the man who had spent years making me feel invisible. But maybe that was the point. Maybe love isn't always warm and obvious and easy to recognize. Maybe sometimes it's cold and distant and wrapped in lessons that hurt to learn but make you stronger in the learning. The pottery studio felt different when I returned to it the next morning. The same shelves lined the walls. The same wheel sat in the center of the room. The same tools lay ready for work. But everything had changed because I had changed. I wasn't the abandoned daughter anymore, the forgotten child creating beauty from scraps of attention. I was the chosen one, the valued one, the daughter whose quiet strength had been recognized and rewarded beyond anything I could have imagined. But you know what? I kept working, kept creating, kept finding peace in the honest response of clay to gentle pressure and patient shaping. Because the money didn't change who I was at my core. Someone who found meaning in making beautiful things, who believed in the value of creating rather than consuming. The legal battles came, exactly as Morrison had predicted. Margaret and Vanessa hired expensive lawyers and filed challenges claiming undue influence, mental incompetence, fraud. They painted me as a manipulative opportunist who had somehow tricked a dying man into rewriting his will. But Dad had been thorough in his planning. The psychological evaluations he'd undergone, the witness statements, the documented timeline of his decision-making process, it all supported the validity of his final wishes. The challenges failed, one by one, leaving Vanessa and Margaret with their $15 and a legal bill that consumed most of Margaret's inheritance. The media attention was harder to handle. Reporters showed up at my studio, wanting to know about the Cinderella inheritance and the family feud that ended in millions. I gave one interview to a local arts magazine and said simply, "My father taught me that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it reveals itself in ways you never expected. I used the money the way I thought Dad would have wanted. Not to change who I was, but to become more fully myself. I expanded the studio, hired other artists, created scholarships for young people who needed a place to learn that beauty could emerge from brokenness. I bought Mrs. Chen a new pottery wheel for her retirement hobby. I funded art therapy programs at local hospitals and schools, and I kept creating. Piece by piece, day by day, finding in the clay the same truth I'd discovered in Dad's letters, that love takes many forms, that strength can look like surrender, that sometimes the greatest gift is learning you don't need the gift to be whole. Vanessa tried to contact me once, about a year after the will reading, a long email full of apologies and explanations and requests for reconciliation. She'd lost her job, she said, lost her fiancé when he discovered her inheritance was gone, lost the life she'd built on the assumption that money and position would always protect her. I read the email twice, then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Some relationships are broken in ways that can't be repaired, damaged by choices that leave scars too deep for healing. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it just means letting go. But I kept Dad's letters, all of them. And sometimes, when the studio is quiet and my hands are covered in clay and the light is slanting through the windows just right, I can feel him there, watching, proud, finally able to show the love he'd carried in silence for so many years. The last piece I made before finishing this story sits on the shelf beside my wheel. It's a simple bowl, elegant in its restraint, with a golden vein running through a crack that formed during firing. I could have discarded it, called it flawed, started over with perfect clay. Instead, I made the damage part of the design, turned the breakage into beauty. Just like Dad taught me, in the end, just like love does, when you're patient enough to let it reveal its true form. Vanessa chased numbers her whole life, bank accounts and achievements, and the external validation that comes from other people's approval. But I just wanted Dad's truth. I wanted to know that the quiet girl in the corner, the one making art from mud and hope, mattered to someone. Turns out, truth compounds faster than interest. For 25 years, I'd been investing in something I couldn't see: patience, dignity, the stubborn belief that love existed even when it was hidden. And when it finally matured, when the books were balanced and the final accounting was done, it paid dividends beyond anything money could provide. It paid in peace. If you've ever been called less than, hit subscribe right now. Because someday, your silence will speak for itself, and you'll want the world to be listening. Comment below where you're watching from. Let's see how far truth travels tonight. Because here's what I know now, that I didn't know then. The meek really do inherit the earth. Not because they're weak, but because they're strong enough to wait for it. Strong enough to build something beautiful, while others are busy tearing things down. Strong enough to know that the best victories are the ones where you don't have to defeat anyone else to win. You just have to become yourself so completely, so authentically, that when the final accounting comes, there's no question who deserves what. The universe knows, love knows, truth knows, and in the end, that's all that matters. The clay never lied to me, and neither, it turns out, did my father. He just waited until I was ready to hear the truth.